And welcome to the Spring 2024 Framingham State University Scholarly and Creative Showcase. My name is May Hara. I am currently Director of CELTS, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight. This showcase series is the creation of the CELTS Scholarship and Creative Practice Subcommittee. And I'd like to thank Joanne Britland, Ray Zhang, Catherine Dignam, Lissa Bolletino, and of course, Sarah Mulhall Edelman and Gretchen Demore for their work in making this evening's event possible. Tonight, you will hear from 4 faculty members from the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Framingham State University about their work with Families as They Really Are, published by W.W. Norton. I'm so glad to be able to say just a few words of introduction for all 4 before handing the floor over to Dr. Virginia Rutter, editor of the Norton book and our facilitator for the evening. Dr. Xavier Guadalupe Diaz is associate professor, criminology coordinator, and interim department chair in sociology and criminology. His research focuses on intimate partner violence in LGBTQ+ communities with an emphasis on transgender victimization. He's published 2 books with New York University Press, over 25 scholarly papers, and has been featured on CNN's Forensic Files 2, The Washington Post, and Business Insider. Dr. Patricia Sanchez Connolly was born in El Salvador and immigrated to the United States when she was 11 years old. She is an associate professor, advocate, and activist who works with young adults and higher education professionals to bring awareness to issues of social justice. Her research focuses on ways that communities of color create different forms of capital to resist racism, discrimination, and oppression. Dr. Beth Whaley is professor of criminology at Framingham State University. She has published research on incarcerated women's mental health and sexual trauma, prison abolition, rape crisis centers, and institutional sexual assault response. I'd like to just take a moment here to signal that Patricia, Xavier, and Beth will be traveling to El Paso with 10 students during spring break for the Border Awareness Experience, where they will meet with organizations and advocates who work directly with migrants at the border and stay and volunteer at a shelter. There are opportunities to support this initiative, which we can hopefully share at the end of the evening. And then finally, Dr. Virginia Rutter is professor of sociology emerita. She retired in 2022, but luckily for us at Framingham State, still teaches courses related to families and research methods, and is obviously very much involved in the work, community, and life at FSU. She continues to do research and writes in her new home base, Washington, D.C. And with that, I'll hand things over to Virginia.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me do this. So thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to May, Gretchen, Sarah, and Lissa, and all the folks at CELTS for organizing another valuable teaching and learning opportunity. Thanks to the Department of Education and Social and Crim for their co-sponsorship of the event. Thanks to Luis Rodriguez, and the reason for the sign right here, for his excellent event poster. So what you see here is the cover of our book, Families as They Really Are, the 3rd edition, with my awesome co-editors, Christy Williams from Ohio State, Barbara Risman from University of Illinois at Chicago. And here's our poster. Here's Families as They Really Are, the FSU edition, which I'm very pleased to have had the chance to share with you all here. So hold on, I've got to get my screens going here. I want to also say thanks to the 60 some odd authors that contributed to the amazing edited volume that I was proud to lead. We are here to dig into this book with 4 of those many contributors, including myself. A special shout out at the top to my former students who worked on the book. Tyler Ristine, who's in the house, FSU class of 23, was an editorial assistant supported by grants several years from CELTS. And so Tyler is here. And Ruby Alberti, who is Colorado College class of 2028, worked closely with me for the last year as a CCF research associate. FSU's Allie Chisholm is also in the room. And yes, she was also a CCF intern with me when I was working in the past on editions of Families as They Really Are. 3 cheers for Norton, who has published this book and helps get it to students all over the country. In the chat, you'll see some links to the things that I've mentioned to you. So you should be able to click on and take a look at some of those things. We've produced this highly readable, updated book to help our students dig deeply into family diversity and change. Turns out that it's not just students, but members of our community, our families, our friends are very interested in the content of the book. All proceeds support the Council on Contemporary Families, which is a group of scholars committed to advancing grounded knowledge that is accessible and clear to all. And that's what you're going to get today. Now to the book. Today, when struggles over what is true dominate the news and public debate, thinking about what really is has never been more important. Indeed, the first chapter of the book is How Do We Tell What's True by Philip Cohen, a sociologist at the University of Maryland. For True, students read this book at a time when ways to make a family or become a family are expanding. But at the same time, political divisions about these very families have widened, often using battles over the truth. And so we are attentive to cases of exclusion and puzzles of inclusion throughout. And those battles for the truth, my former students and friends will know, are why we love to talk about epistemology in our classes. To wit, a little later, FSU sociology professor Patricia Sanchez Connolly will tell us more about the power of immigrant families, as well as the resistance to immigrant families' wisdom and perspectives in higher education. Criminologist and sociology and crim department chair Xavier Guadalupe Diaz will tell us more about how our very bodies have historically been coded into belonging in a family, with the line being drawn to put trans people outside, including when their physical and emotional safety is at stake. Criminologist Beth Whaley shows us that at our peril do we neglect to see, believe, and learn from gay, lesbian, trans, and queer family members, including and especially in cases of abuse. They are telling us about families as they really are. The authors in Families as They Really Are were selected for excellence, but also because they care about social change, pushing forward with new ideas, and they are connected as teachers and scholars to students and students' perspectives. I have to keep this moving, but please take a look at the table of contents of this book. And let me just take a second to put this in the chat because I didn't give this link to Gretchen. So what I'm going to do now is I transition. So that's a little bit about our book, Families as They Really Are. And what's going to happen now is I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about my chapter, The Case for Divorce, before we hear from my awesome colleagues. So I share my chapter, The Case for Divorce, today because it gives you an inkling of the approach and opportunity of the book. The Case for Divorce does the kind of myth-busting that our scholars do. Let me read a little bit from the opening chapter, where I started by saying, the opening of the chapter. Do you know the answer to this question? Is the divorce rate increasing in the United States? Try Googling it. I asked one of my top students to do this in a meeting with me. Before Googling, they guessed, I think it's going up. The spoiler, as my student was reminded, the divorce rate has not increased in the United States since 1980. That was more than 40 years ago. In the past 20, it has declined overall, though rates vary by group. Even so, we keep hearing the story of increasing divorce rates. Famed historian Stephanie Coontz has called this type of thinking a nostalgia trap. And she discusses this in her chapter that's also in our book. How are thoughtful, studious people like my student, maybe you, like a lot of people we come into contact with daily, how can they be left with the impression that a myth that is roundly false seems like just common sense? That's from the book. To review the facts, I have exactly one slide. I have one slide for my talk. And so I'm going to share that. Just give me a second. There we go. So this is a slide, seeing is believing, and this shows you the divorce rate from 1860 to 1960, where was a steady trend. This is the crazy World War II blip. But then you see from 1960 to 1980, it went up. And then this is the part that people don't know about, is that the divorce rate has been declining in all this time. And it's still high, and the data are complicated. But I just show that to you as it's like, oh, I didn't know that. That's the only point. And by the way, this is from Philip Cohen's book, The Family, also a Norton book, 3rd edition in the 10th chapter. And it's the book that my students use in our families class. So the divorce gets talked about, though, as like those unwise or selfish people who get divorced. But that doesn't align with what we've learned about the impact of divorce. As Xavier would say, we need more nuance, and no doubt he'll get to that later tonight. When I started this work 2 decades ago, there was an industry of bad social science research growing up around avoiding this fact and touting this case for marriage. Another chapter in the book on the marriage movement by Melanie Heath at McMaster University in Ontario and Jennifer Randles at California State can tell you even more about that, what's happening with that. But how have we ended up having a lot of quasi-science make folks believe that marriage is a cure-all and divorce is a disaster? Now, as an aside, please know the story is complicated because divorce is not an ideal, but the simplest takeaway, and this is, if you're, get ready, the simplest takeaway is that when families are distressed or highly conflictual, divorce is better than staying together, better for the adults, better for the children. In the chapter, I show step by step how I weigh claims about marriage and divorce, and these are easy lessons on research methods. So what this chapter is about, it's a case for divorce, but it's also a case for research methods, so which are a great thing for everyone to pay attention to. There are 3 things any reader of marriage and divorce research should look out for when assessing information. And here they come. Ask whether marital quality has been considered and how it's been measured. Simple question. Ask if domestic violence or other pathologies in the home have been examined. Have they been taken into account? And look for whether selection effects or situations that occurred prior to the marriage and that don't have anything to do with the marriage or the divorce itself, but that make people more likely to divorce. Ask if those selection effects have been tested. There's a final point. So those are the 3 questions, 3 methods questions. And in the chapter, we go into them and I go into them in more detail. But there's a final point that links to some of what we do in the entire book. Extending the case for divorce is not just about rebutting divorce shaming, but shame on other family structures that happen, especially the shaming that happens to single parent families, where the question should be single parent compared to what? The question of what are the resources a family have is another question to ask. The question of who are the actual people in the group that are being named when we talk about single parent families is an important thing to be consider, because family structure shaming has frequently been a not so low-key dog whistle for shaming and blaming people of color, especially Black women, for barriers set up for them. Another chapter titled Racism, Family Structure, and Black Families by Dedrick Williams, professor of sociology at University of Tennessee, and his colleagues developed this story. So does the chapter Family Structure, Race, and Child Well-Being by professor of sociology Christina Cross at Harvard University. So we covered these ideas from a variety of angles. At the end of the day, claims about divorce or single parent families are just 2 examples of conversations about family structure that can have the tendency to blame individuals for things that are about resources and direct our attention away from resources and context. The kind of attention that we like to focus on as sociologists, but I think we all can join in that project. I could go on, but you get the point. This is the kind of work that Families as They Really Are does, digging into facts, digging into methods, digging into perspectives. At last, to my colleagues at FSU, they have been rock stars at just this kind of critical work, the kind of critical work I'm hoping to represent to you with their teaching, their research, their scholarship, and with their activism and the ways that those are linked together. I realized that I had asked 3 colleagues who are not sociologists of family or work on that project at all, but I was sure they could speak to interests, to audiences interested in families as they really are. And in fact, the book pulls from many different fields as they have to offer. So as I wrap up, I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Patricia Sanchez Connolly. Patricia is going to be speaking about her chapter, Si Puedes, Latinx Families in Higher Education. You heard about her already in the introduction, including the trip that Beth and Patricia are taking students on this spring break. All I can say is I was fortunate to work with her at FSU, and we are very lucky to have her here tonight. Patricia?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rudder. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Shout out to former students, alumni, and current students, and obviously my colleagues who are here tonight, including my mom there somewhere. So yeah, good afternoon, good evening. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I became interested, I guess, in working on this project. Virginia said, you know, we'd like to kind of diversify the topics of the book and provide the opportunity for folks to learn more about different communities. My research over the past decade has revolved around immigrant students of color who are often first-generation college students. While working on my dissertation research, I focused on high-achieving immigrant high school students, and I kind of worked my way backwards. So I sought out to interview and gather stories of what we would consider academically successful students. So students who were about to graduate, students who were enrolled in advanced courses, students who might have taken part in dual enrollment opportunities, and so on. So I did my research and I decided to interview and look at folks who were part of a summer and after school program, and also attended a local community college. I noticed something very interesting while doing my interviews, and that is that when I asked about what motivated them to keep going, what motivated them to stay in school, what motivated them to, you know, continue dealing with the struggle of having to work and having to help family and having to do well in school, many of them often switched to Spanish and talked about their families, specifically their parents' sacrifice as their main motivator. I ended up writing a bit about how students would retell the story of their parents' journey to the United States. And in that way, they would recreate a frame of reference between their native country and the United States. Whether it was, you know, growing up, I didn't have a pencil that I could just use to go to school, or my own story of, you know, being in 4th, 5th grade, but not being allowed to take a test because I didn't purchase my own paper to write the test on. And so creating that dual frame of reference for students was really important. And most of them talked about that. And again, part of that was listening to their parents' immigrant story and how their journey to the United States and the challenges that they had faced in the United States really served as a motivator for them to stay in school and do well in school as a way of repaying their parents' sacrifice. So this work seemed to be significant for the book because I wanted to, again, highlight the contributions that Latinx families, in particular, immigrant families, make when it comes to helping students succeed. And I will be talking a little bit more about some other stuff later. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. It's a great chapter. Everybody should read it. Now we have Xavier Guadalupe Diaz on his chapter, Queering Intimate Partner Violence Through Transgender Inclusion. X and I have collaborated on research, on organizing, and always on teaching. And his ideas unify these areas like no one I've ever seen before. So Xavier, please go ahead.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks to everyone for being here. I found myself, being invited to contribute to this awesome volume, the third edition of this great volume, as a queer criminologist that studies intimate partner violence within lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. So I kind of often find myself sharing space and company with family scholars, even though I don't really identify as a family scholar. But of course, studying family violence is kind of how I come into the mix here. So even though a broad range of contributors in the volume talk about different things like economics and labor, racism and family socialization, divorce, all those kinds of things, I come in with an angle that looks at the social conditions really that foster or really create opportunities for abuse and violence between partners. And so within that perspective, I'm really in the chapter and really throughout my work looking at social and cultural norms, institutions, social expectations, and more of those topics, how they inform basically power differentials in relationships. And invariably, power seems to be an aspect of all of our relationships, for better or for worse. And sometimes that power can be really leveraged against partners' vulnerabilities, trap partners to control them, control their lives, who they are. So my chapter, in a way, is an examination of kind of the broader queering techniques that I bring into a lot of my research. And by queering, I mean not just the inclusion of LGBTQ plus perspectives, which of course is important because we've been marginalized in this literature, in policy and action around family violence, but also just kind of how queering kind of disrupts some of these normative expectations about how violence goes in romantic relationships. So in the chapter itself, I'm kind of zooming out first, looking at how IPV came to be considered a social problem for most of human history. It was just considered a private problem. Now it's a political and social problem, thanks to the work of feminists of the 1970s. But of course, there's a critical examination of that history. Who was left out, whose ideas, whose actions, people of color, women of color, Black women, women of lower socioeconomic statuses, queer and transgender people, importantly. And I really want to critique the dominant notion in the field that gender is the main variable that influences how IPV is experienced, that gender is sort of the sole cause of how we understand partner violence. So I'm hoping that through queering gender in IPV, I can kind of help illuminate some of the distinct realities faced by transgender survivors of that kind of violence. We probably hear, if you're in tune at all with trans violence out in mainstream society, you hear a lot about hate-motivated violence, which of course is an important topic, kind of stranger-based crimes, when in reality, the data show that partners, people known to transgender people, are some of the main perpetrators of this kind of violence. And so I want to complicate more how gender is not just structured by our patriarchal culture, but really getting down to the situation, from the top down, how violence is experienced, and in a way, how that gendered power intersects with other systems of oppression, regardless of assumed hierarchies in society. So, for example, my research shows how abusive partners of trans people exploit vulnerabilities caused by this trans antagonistic culture that we live in, tactics like identity abuse that I cover in the chapter, manipulation of insecurities, and a lot more, and how that all kind of fits into this broader pattern of structural violence, like the extreme economic marginalization, poverty, housing insecurity, healthcare insecurity that we know transgender people are more likely to experience. We know those are the conditions that limit agency, that create these precarious situations that some people find themselves in. And abusive partners can latch onto those sites of vulnerability and really make violence happen in a way that entraps our queer and trans friends and family members. So that's a little bit about kind of what I bring to the chapter, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about some of those ideas.
Xavier, thank you. As you were speaking, I was reminded of editing your chapter and those difficult moments over feminist history that really were made the chapter really fantastic because you won. So, okay, finally, Beth Whaley shares Queering Family Sexual Violence, her chapter, a brilliant chapter from a great thinker and activist and teacher. Beth, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Virginia, for setting up the panel, and everyone for your hard work on it. I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to start off similarly, talking about how I came to decide on the topic for my chapter after Virginia invited me. Because my area of research is sexual violence, and specifically with a focus on institutional responses to sexual violence, as she also mentioned in my introduction. Generous. And what I study about family, therefore, is usually limited to child sexual abuse and sexual violence between intimate partners, is how I think about family. And so I was excited about the possibility of expanding this towards more of the family literature, place to grow, especially because Dr. Guadalupe Diaz and I have actually published a couple pieces working on queering sexual violence more generally. And as part of that work, we've explored the different layers of betrayal that occur when sexual violence occurs within the queer community, as well as the power analysis that he got into a little bit, and we can talk about more in the Q&A session if needed. So when Dr. Rutter asked what I might like to write about, it seemed like an interesting extension that I could make of that work, since queer community is a family and often takes the place of family, or is in addition to other more traditional ideas of family. And as a member of that community, I think of myself as having both a biological family and a chosen family or a queer family. I have a very active text thread called Queer Family. So I thought it would be really interesting to expand that level of thinking into the family literature. And then because I research sexual violence, the questions become, what happens then when this trust and betrayal is violated in this type of family, when there's sexual violence that occurs within this alternative type of family there? So usually when we talk about family sexual violence, again, as I mentioned, that's usually child sexual abuse or marital rape, which is already a very restrictive way to think about sexual violence that happens between partners. It really relies on understanding family as part of the state through the institution of marriage, or through legal adoption, or through genetics and biology, through having children biologically or being related by blood. But for queer people, close queer friends are often, in fact, their chosen kinship family. And when we talk about family sexual violence without thinking about these kinship ties, we're really erasing and flattening our understanding of sexual violence more generally. If what's interesting about thinking about family sexual violence is betrayal and a betrayal of trust, less interesting is like the blood ties, right? Because often when we talk about family sexual violence, we'll be talking about people like stepfathers, right? So it's not just this blood tie, but often the betrayal of trust within a family that family violence is already used to talking about. So my chapter asked the question that if family sexual violence is distinguished by this betrayal of trust and safety, how do the limitations that we place on our understanding of family restrict this understanding of the harm of sexual violence and the responses to it, of course, since that's my main focus academically. And so I do this in two ways in the chapter. One, by expanding the definition of family to include queer community and chosen families. And then the other element is that same queering the idea of sexual violence in power dynamics that Dr. Guadalupe Diaz also started to talk about as well. This might be familiar, I mean, definitely to the queer people in the room, but also maybe to the less queer people in the room. The idea of like, is he family is a common question that we'll ask one another, or I think she's family. Is a fun game to play when you're out and about and trying to figure out who you think might also be queer, right? And so this idea of family and queerness are deeply linked. And that is something that actually, in my research for the chapter, I discovered goes back to the Middle Ages. The idea of kinship families is not just a queer thing even in the last 100 years, but goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. However, specific to queer communities, this familial language is tied back to gay men's culture in New York, especially in ballroom culture. It was documented most famously in a documentary from 1990 called Paris is Burning, where ballroom culture is documented, as well as house culture, family-like structures, where mothers and fathers provide support for their children through social support, friendship networks, expansive expression of genders and sexualities, and so on and so forth. These houses, interestingly, formed in response to rejection and marginalization from their families of origin, communities, and societies at large. So
you won't even take this over there.
Exactly, Ingrid. And so in this way, queer definitions of family do not only expand to include queer community, again, as Xavier mentioned, but also allow us all to recreate our formulations of family, right? Who in your family do you consider kin that are not necessarily tied in these ways? If you have aunties and uncles who are close friends of the family, right? And that's nice. And it's also awful then when violence happens with those people too. And just as awful as it would be with the more traditional family ties. So there's a lot more in the chapter, of course. Highly recommend the book. But what the important takeaway that I want to leave for the chapter is about, okay, so what do we do with these expanded definitions of family and the expanded definitions of queering sexual violence through an understanding of power? Because increased criminalization, an abolitionist is going to finish it off here by saying, this doesn't mean we should expand our definition of family and therefore expand the carceral state or expand prisons and prosecution, in my opinion. So in my chapter, I delve into transformative justice solutions. There's been transformative justice scholars who have suggested and actually created responses to this harm of family sexual violence that exists completely outside the state. Because sexual violence scholars have documented that the typical prison, carceral assault, sexual assault solutions perpetuate sexual violence. They increase it, they make it worse. You can increase the penalties for sexual violence, you can increase the prison length, and it doesn't decrease sexual violence. If anything, it's been increasing since we started increasing penalties for those crimes. But there's so much hope in the transformative justice movement. In fact, I came into that movement from an organization called the Bay Area BATJC, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative. Their entire focus is child sexual abuse. Sometimes we think about responses to harm. It feels more okay to think about abolition and responses to harm for smaller crimes. What I love about transformative justice is it takes on these big things like child sexual abuse. And I'm excited to talk so much more about that. Thank you for listening.
Beth, thank you for that. And thank you for punctuating this with your particular takeaway, because the takeaway in your chapter is something that I've found. So you were able to connect so well the kind of what is family and why we care about it by taking this case, but then going on and saying, I've got a thing to do about it. And I've got a thing to say about it, which I can't say very well. So I'm just going to call it a thing, but you do a great job. And so What we're going to do now is I have a couple of questions that we talked about that I was going to ask the four of us before we open it up to the whole crowd of folk we have here to talk. And so I wondered if Patricia or Xavier, you wanted to talk a little bit about your takeaways, if that was something that you wanted to do.
Sure. So there were a handful of takeaways that I wanted the readers to really kind of think about, and not only think about, but also process, right? And also see whether or not they themselves had experienced that. So I want to start off by saying that according to the National Center of Education Statistics, Latinx students had the highest dropout rates of all racial and ethnic groups at 7.7%, compared to 4.1% for white students. So anytime that there's research done on Latinx students, it usually focuses on studying familism, which is a cultural value among Latinx families that is characterized by loyalty and closeness to the family. Most researchers, however, look at familism as a form of deficit. And so anytime that we look to explain the reasons why Latinx students have high dropout rates, we never tend to focus on the positive, but rather use this deficit lens to really try to explain away the reasons why that may be the case. So in terms of familism, we may hear or we may read that, a student has too many family obligations, right? And therefore they're unable to do their homework, or they are unable to go to school or move away. So family obligations are always placed before individual needs. However, it's important to also look at the closeness to family as an example of familial capital, which is the way that I look at my data and the way that I also ask my research question, which is through a critical race framework and Latino critical race framework, and more specifically, the community wealth framework. So the way in which students understand that familial capital that is passed on can impact their academic trajectories, and also the way in which they make decisions about their careers. So my work challenges that narrative that familism has negative effects on Latinx students. So I want to point out that Latinx families, immigrant families, have a knowledge base that comes in many forms that allows students to feel supported and motivated and committed to earning their degree. So while predominantly white culture may not recognize bilingualism, biculturalism, and commitment to community as a valuable knowledge base, my research and that of other critical race scholars really show and provide evidence of the ways in which students are able to access resources within their communities and navigate academic environments in a successful way that then leads to them graduating high school, graduating college, and entering the workforce.
Thanks, Patricia. I'm glad that you added that, especially because familism is one of the topics that we're focused on in my course this week. So in my families class, I'm passing notes to my students and giving them hints. I had some questions. This is sort of free form. Or X, did you want to do a takeaway, or?
I can add just really briefly, just some of the takeaways I'm hoping that the chapter contributes. One, I'm hoping that by including transgender experiences in the IPV, that we're really complicating a bit of this longstanding history of kind of having a bit of a rigid structural understanding of who we think of as victims and who we think of as abusers in family violence and in intimate relationships, so that we kind of capture a lot more experiences. I often, like when I'm talking about my work, I think people tend to assume automatically that the abuser of a transgender partner is cisgender and not transgender. And in my research, I'm finding that's not true. In fact, that regardless of identity, people can choose to leverage vulnerabilities and power differentials and stuff in ways that even would undermine their own who they are, if it's something that can be used to undermine a partner. And I'm hoping too that by doing so, we're not just bringing in voices that have been historically excluded, but that we're also looking at these structural conditions that I mentioned earlier. If you're interested in reducing violence, then you're interested in tackling the structural conditions that inform violence. Like I mentioned earlier about poverty, economic marginalization, healthcare, and really acknowledging the moment right now that we're in. Anti-trans politics, the backlash is real. Over the last few years alone, there have been over 400 different state policies, legislation introduced around the US targeting transgender healthcare, and transgender people's just right to exist out openly in public, and how all of that kind of paints or really contextualizes violence that might be experienced in relationships.
Thanks, X. What I'm reminded of in this conversation is seeing how the work of each chapter is about the content, but it's about a way of thinking about, and I would say thinking about families, but thinking about humans. And that brings me to my next question, which is it can be a little bit of a personal one, but it's how did the work that you're doing become an important topic to you? And you said a little bit at the beginning about it. And so, go as far or as not far as you want, but I'd love to hear how this got to be your topic.
Okay, I guess I could start again. So this topic is important to me because it's also my story and the story of so many people that I love, whether they're, my family members or my students. Like Dr. Hara mentioned, I'm an immigrant from El Salvador, and I came here when I was 11 years old. And so my experience in predominantly white academic spaces as a student always demanded that I shed who I am in order to be able to engage with the material, to have working relationships with professors, to be able to get the resources that I needed to succeed. But yet, the source of my own motivation and the reason for the work that I do has always been centered around my experience as an immigrant student, an immigrant undocumented student, to add to that. There was never a space for me to be able to share the things I knew how to do, because, as a child, I was one of the only people who spoke English, right? And so I was able to navigate all these places. Immigrant children know how to interpret, how to fill out official forms, how to get the information that we need in our native language. So what if you got a B in algebra your sophomore year in high school? You just finished interpreting an entire loan closing at a local bank at the ripe age of 12, before or after you helped, your mom's friend enroll her child in kindergarten. Where's the grade for that? How do we transfer the skills that our immigrant students have that are so valuable and so resourceful into the academic space? And so that's why this is important to me. I'm going to pick on Beth.
Yeah. I just loved that. I was like, yeah, where is the snap reaction? I couldn't find it. I went with the claps. But absolutely to that. How I came into this, how this is important to me. I think in my traditional studies of sexual violence, that becomes the most conversation centers around cisgender men who commit sexual violence against cisgender women. And because that is the majority of sexual assault, definitely. And it's certainly the majority of sexual assault that gets into the criminal legal system. And again, because I study institutional responses, that's often then became what I was always talking about and studying, and that's still really important to me. But I was so much more interested in how that's a conversation about gender more broadly, and not gender in terms of like assigned at, sex assigned at birth and gender assigned at birth often by society from there. And so what was exciting about this chapter is it allows us to have larger conversations for me that aren't so heteronormative. And then I also felt like in the heteronormative focus that my work often takes, I was sort of like ignoring something. And this is something I've talked about a lot with my colleagues here. Like, what am I ignoring or afraid to talk about because of this specific focus? And often that's something that also Dr. Guadalupe Diaz referenced, which is stereotypes around queer people as sexually violent. And, this harmful idea that that queer people are sexually violent and dangerous. And so I often avoided that conversation because I wanted to avoid that stereotype and the damage that that's done in our community. And then I thought, that's not helping anything. Avoiding a conversation just makes the uninformed side of that conversation louder and louder. So I was excited to be able to take something on that I felt like I was avoiding even academically, to be able to have a larger conversation more productively.
Amazing, y'all. So there's a theme here about how we fit into all of our topics with a personal angle, and how that informs a lot of our academic work. For me, I got interested in studying violence sociologically in early undergrad. And I think especially as a Latino queer man born in Puerto Rico, I was really looking to make sense out of my own experiences and how and why people like me were excluded or invisible. And I found a lot of clarity in thinking about how social structure informed or facilitated those experiences I had, as we're hearing from our colleagues tonight. And I found solidarity in how marginalized, historically oppressed groups resisted and called out harmful patterns. And that really kind of is what I bring into how I think about queer relationships, and making more sense out of how to respond in ways that we haven't in the past, and hopefully improving the lives of queer and trans people in that regard.
Well, you've been doing quite a lot of that, X. So, I'm going to ask one more question before we turn it over to all the people in this space with us for them to ask questions and give comments. But my question is, it's a Framingham question. It's how do you incorporate the work that you're sharing into courses? And what ends up being important when you're teaching? What ends up being important to students, and what ends up being important to you? So the students' points of view that you know about, and your point of view and how you teach it are things that I'm asking about. And I'll talk about that too.
So I am currently teaching an immigration in the US course, and I actually have some students in the room. So shout out to Heather, Karina, a few others, Destiny. So I would love to kind of, you all can put stuff in the chat as well if you'd like. But we are, up until now, we have been talking about the push and pull factors for folks to migrate. And actually today, we had a really great conversation about the folks who are having to sleep at Logan Airport. And, we started having these conversations about how migrants are actually superheroes, right? That it's sometimes easier for us to think of them as poor, not to quote Ursula here, but like poor, unfortunate souls, right? And feel sad and, oh my God, pobrecitos. And it's like, no, absolutely not. They literally just made this amazing, active choice to leave behind what they thought were not good conditions, and they did something about it. How many of us just take shit for the rest of our lives? Right? So reframing anything and everything to a deficit lens, I think has been helpful. We will get into education eventually in the course. And so there, of course, we'll talk about, and I will have students also share how their own parents communicated and verbalized academic expectations. Some of us grew with our parents, helping us do our homework and telling us or asking us if we did our homework. Others grew up with parents saying, I didn't come to this country, so you could insert anything fun after that. Go to the movies, go to the mall. Yes, that may sound different to some of us, but guess what? Your parent telling you that over and over is what my students and my respondents mentioned, that, that was something that really motivated me, right? Because it's helping to create that dual frame of reference. So I can't wait to hear the ways in which my students in that class specifically had their parents tell their immigrant story so that they could be at Framingham State.
I'll go next, just to switch up the order, So how I incorporate it into my classes, I will say I teach a class on sexual violence, so that's pretty straightforward in terms of how I'd incorporate it. I assigned the chapter, or a chapter with Dr. Guadalupe Diaz and I in that class. I'm excited to assign this chapter as well in the future now that it's published. And we talk about power the whole time, that power analysis, the queering of power analysis, the queering of gender and power analysis, definitely. Sexual violence, I think, makes the most sense. But in all my other classes, understanding violence, victimization, and justice, and serial killers, we'll be talking always about the power dynamics of it all. And so bringing in these examples that help us expand away from, yes, cis men largely commit the majority of all types of violence, but not because they're cis men, but because of power structures, right? And because of the way that power is arranged in our society. And so in that way, it plays into my classes all the time.
For me, similar to Dr. Whaley, I teach a class called Intimate Partner Violence, Crim 321 at Framingham. So I'm always bringing in my research on transgender IPV. There's lots of different ways that I bring it in. So I'm just thinking about what tends to resonate a lot with students. And I like to bring in what we've learned about identity abuse tactics by abusive partners that undermine, redirect, or reshape a partner's sense of self. The anchor point being how trans identities are structurally marginalized, but then connecting that to a broader audience by showing how we all engage in identity work, that kind of social process of signaling who we are to other people, getting feedback from those people, or even imagined or the perceived feedback. And then how we then take that back sort of inward to inform ourselves, to inform our own internal sense of who we are. I think students get really into that idea, and with trans people at the focal point, and then kind of zooming out and thinking about how these issues affect all of us. And then beyond that, really being able to, if this isn't your own lived experience, kind of step into what that might be like, these experiences, and really through that, engaging in that kind of discomfort zone, kind of really pushing students to think creatively about these issues.
That's great. For me, the work that I do, the way that the work that I've done on Families as They Really Are relates to how I teach, or what happens when I teach. There are two things that are really important. One is bringing all the information the well-vetted information about divorce, about narratives about family structure, about queer families, about immigrant families in the kinds of discussions that Patricia is describing. All of these things are things that I'm bringing to students, but the other piece of it that they just want to sort of go step by step by step, learning these things that are many times their stories. When I was editing your chapters, I was picturing the students for whom these chapters are telling them something about themselves, as well as the students who didn't know about this at all. And that was that's really powerful about when you're putting, knowledge out in the world. But the second thing is about a commitment that I have for myself and for others, which is to say that, there's nothing so complicated that we can't find a way to explain it and understand it. So, for example, Beth and Xavier have been talking about queering, which for a lot of people is still, it's a work in progress in coming to understand it. But your work in communicating about it helps many people, including those who are inside queer communities, understand what you're talking about. And I think that that's some of what brings me to teaching, is that kind of belief that yes, we can understand big ideas, that we're all entitled to putting our hands around big ideas. And there's no topic better than topics related to families and connection to say that this is at home and real for all of us. So that's me. So we asked y'all, everybody else here in the room, students, community members, friends, family, to ask your questions. And so you can put your hand up, or you can, oh, great. Or put them in the chat if you're shy. But Zeynep, please.
Thank you so much. All of you were it's so amazing. And I happily got the book, so I will get to the chapters. But just listening to you and how you brought the family literature into this, and how you actually have come together in this one, as also we are all in the same department. This is so beautiful to see. Just in terms of I have a general question, two general questions actually. One is actually, this is not family literature, is not your main literature, right? Patricia, you mentioned that you are using this terminology in your general work, familialism, but it is not necessarily your focus, and it wasn't the case for XU and BetU, right? And so you came into this literature, and you brought your expertise in your field in conversation with this literature. So what are you going to take from this literature, from this work, into your work? That's my question. That's the first one, but also the other one is about the editorial process. Your editor here, and I'm actually curious about the process for you, if there's any highlights, because I know Virginia is amazing, supportive mentor, but also as an editor, how was it for you? That's what I'm also curious about.
I can speak about the process because I felt like I had a really good experience. Usually when you're writing, as you know, it's hard to get the words out and it's hard to get it done. And I'm, guilty of putting things and waiting on things until it's the very last minute. What I did appreciate was that the voice and the tone, and I appreciated Virginia saying to me, college students will be reading this text. And so as you write, that is your audience. It's not necessarily other academics, right? But making it more accessible for folks to be able to read. So like asking questions in the text. And I think the entire book was really cool. When I saw it, it looked amazing. But there were follow-ups in between each of the chapters, right, that connected the material and, to follow the thread. And I found that was really interesting.
Sure, I can talk about my process too. I also had a good experience in the process. It was daunting in a lot of ways, as you suggest, Zainab. It was very daunting to be like, sure, I'm going to write a chapter on families, and I'm going to send it to a colleague who I very much respect and see in a lot of ways as a mentor, and just see how that goes. Let me get educated on the family research real quick, and then send a draft off to an expert in families. Cool. This will be fun. But it also, it pushed me to get back into, it was exciting to get into a new subject area, because you can get kind of pigeonholed, especially post-grad school, into your own topics. And so it pushed me to be like, okay, what are people saying about families as they really are? And then digging into that, getting to read the previous edition of the book to see which of these chapters are going to help inform was a really fun and iterative experience that really helped build the draft for me. And then similarly, I really loved the edits that Virginia provided, helped shape a similar voice and add like a lot of explanation. And I loved the accessibility of it. I liked not writing to, try to seem smart, but writing to be accessible so that people can understand your ideas, and stepping away from these big terms that we get so used to throwing around and being like, but what does that term actually mean? Dr. Angela Davis is a hero of mine and is so good at that, and so good at saying like, if someone doesn't understand the words that we're using, then those words are pointless, right? So don't use those words, and use the words that connect to people, because that's the point of your research. So I love the opportunity to be able to do that. To answer your second question about how I'll bring this back into my more traditional areas of research, I think it helped me dive more into child sexual abuse in a way that I don't talk about that much. I usually focus on over 18, and it helped me get more acquainted with that literature and that approach. And I think that now I feel more comfortable addressing that more broadly in my sexual violence research.
I would just echo a lot of what's already been said. For me, writing the chapter took me a bit out of my comfort zone in terms of I'm just used to writing, like Dr. Whaley was saying, more empirical, data-driven work, and I struggle with writing for a broader audience, making really accessible language and distilling queer theory, which sometimes, gets a lot of criticism for being abstract and gobbledygook words into, actual everyday language that anybody can read. So I really appreciated having the opportunity to do that more than I've done in any other publication, I think. And that's going to be something that's going to carry over for me, I hope at least, is really kind of working on language and how I frame my findings in a way that is going to have more of a broader impact by tackling these, aforementioned issues around language and how the information is received.
Yeah, well, thanks you guys for not saying anything mean. And also, I mean, as the editor, I'm not unaware of our relationships and not unaware of the fact that you are giving a gift to this book. You are donating your labor to do this, and that deserves, all of our labor deserves to be loved, cherished, and respected. And I really don't believe that there is one perfect way to write or say things. On the other hand, when you're talking about complex ideas that go beyond, for example, my comfort zone or my knowledge area, the work necessary to make it possible, it's not that it's impossible to explain. I had an economist once at a seminar at the University of Washington. It was an interdisciplinary seminar. I raised a question, and I raised a hand and asked asked a question about a terminology, and he was like, "Oh, are you a sociologist? No, you want to understand. You're not an economist." So we can do that with all of our terms, and the best economists do that as well. But anyway, let's go to another question. Andrea Fieser, a visitor, is got a question.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, took me a moment to get that going. First of all, I'm the one who sent everybody love when I was actually looking to DM Verge, who I've known for a long time. But as I heard all of you present, I'm like, yes, thank you. So much love for the research and work you're doing. And my question is about how this wonderful work you've done as researchers and writers, how it's impacted your teaching, and maybe if you could talk about one of your favorite moments in the classroom that's informed by the work you've done.
So Andrea, I'll just add, Andrea Fieser is an old friend of mine who's an art history professor at Clemson. And so she thinks a lot about teaching. And I'll start with an answer to Andrea's question, which is that this work that I do informs my teaching every day, but it's actually my teaching informs this work every day, where I am constantly learning from my students how what I think makes sense doesn't 100% make sense, and that we need to update it, that we need to look at it this way, we need to look at it that way. So then the next thing I need to do is not just like, oh, now that's the answer, but find more ways to open up the conversation, to hear all the voices that are present in understanding material that is about human experience. That's what happens. And so the process of writing, the process of editing is the process of thinking together in community. And that happens with students. And we do this in partnership with them. So that's my answer to you, Andrea. It's not very concrete, but it is an answer.
What popped in my head when you asked that question was thinking about, you can talk about power dynamics. I can use my power in the classroom to force a power dynamic conversation constantly. And you could talk about it, but it can be really theoretical. So some of my favorite moments is when I'll assign like a podcast or something about a specific issue. I'm thinking of a podcast that I assigned about pervasive sexual harassment in the workplace. It's called 5 Women. And I think it's a This American Life, which is a regular one that I assign. When I assign a podcast about a specific instance of violence, and then the next day we come in and the students are like, this is how power is at play. This is exactly what we've been talking about. This is, the different dynamics. And when students are able to see an example and analyze it using the framework, those are my favorite moments in the classroom, because hopefully that's something that they can carry once the semester is over.
So we'd love to get some more questions. We've got a couple more minutes before we wrap things up.
I think I have one.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's really unformed, so I shouldn't. I have so many, but it struck me. I just love how how the chapters are talking to one another. It's just amazing. But I was struck. I loved all the movement of zooming out and zooming in, and it made me think about that while there are lots of structural conditions at play, that how families are their own ecosystems too. You know, how families can be countercultural or have a subculture or have, or the familialism is this resource, this et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really interested in how, yes, it's on families live in sociological conditions and economic conditions and all these big structures, superstructure and et cetera. But yeah, just those spaces, kinship spaces, as countercultural space. I just heard as much as it's so important to take not be nostalgic, unsentimental, to take a hard look at these spaces and what happens with danger and violence and betrayal. But I'm coming away too with this sense of like the radical space, the power of families. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
So I'm going to take this first. Lisa Eck, thank you for the question, because it made me think of something else that we're doing at Framingham State, which is a photography project that my students are working on, where my students in the sociology of families for the past few semesters have been working with a foundation in Berkeley, California, Working Assumptions, to take the content of Families as They Really Are, which is the nickname for my families course, and use photography and working with teaching artists to try to do the thing of doing sociology, which can be this kind of boxy, variable driven thing that we're doing, and look at the things that don't fit into the categories that we've talked about, that have looked kind of in the in-between spaces of around intimacy, around a wide variety of issues. And so I think that there are a lot of methods, a lot of methods that we can for looking at families that bring more of us together than we think, so that the four of us on the panel do very different kinds of work, and we connect as we've worked together a lot, but we connect as scholars and as thinkers because of the texture of looking at the content of what we're doing. And I think that, of course, you as an English professor might be particularly, attuned to the texture, but I think that it's something that we can bring in here as well. So I don't know how satisfying that answer was. You can give me a grade later, but that's some of what I think. And it's something really wonderful that we've been able to do in my class at Framingham State, working on the Work Times Family project, but that I think a lot of people do that work of trying to find more ways of knowing. I mean, the thing that Beth did at the beginning of her chapter, and Families That They Really Are, she was talking about a story and I literally cannot remember the specifics of the story, but she was storytelling at the beginning of her chapter in a way that was different. It was a different way of knowing about the experience of who is family, and of being queer, and of coping with abuse. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and we just have to kind of take it to whether we're teaching, writing, or creating curriculum, so that we can all feel what we're doing because we're feeling and thinking together. So I see a question from a student, Alexa. Do sociology books like Families As They Really Are get updated if or when more personal stories are shared? And I'll tell you that the Families as They Really Are has gotten updated several times, but the updates are focused on changing topics, that is updating our topics. And in this edition, we had 17 new chapters. My chapter was revised. It was revised rigorously, but it had been written in the past. But Beth and Xavier and Patricia were amongst 17 contributors who are giving brand new work, because we have brand new topics that need to be pushed and dealt with. And so we change topics, and because there are more personal stories, more personal topics that come up. So that's my answer to that. I see a couple more hands. So Tyler, do you want to?
Yeah, if you guys were to write another chapter for Families as They Really Are for a new edition in the future, what topics would you guys do? Or would you just want to revise your work? Or like, what would you do for a new topic?
I can take this one. I think that I would want to focus more on gendered familism. So I do mention it a little bit in my chapter about how familism can have negative consequences for women, mostly because the expectations that women have, their gender roles are different, right? And so I would want to focus a little bit more on how that affects their academic trajectory.
I can speak to this too, mostly because, as Virginia will remember, I was between two chapters for this edition, so easily can tell you what the other one was. You just have to, not like it better than the one I did do. But so the other chapter that I was thinking about writing was based off of some research I've done in the past about how incarceration affects families, and specifically how incarceration affects mothers. It didn't feasible for this edition, but perhaps the next one. And I would love to bring in an incarcerated woman and who experienced family separation through incarceration to co-author, would be the goal there.
I would add that my chapter ends on querying help responses for IPV survivors, and part of the way it ends is an area of research that I really want to get into more, which is sort of non-carceral, non-criminal legal ways of responding to violence, which Dr. Whaley mentioned earlier, like abolitionist perspectives, but really looking at how communities and families respond to violence. What are structures of accountability? How do we respond to harm within families or against families in a way that doesn't invoke harmful systems that we know don't work, often create more violence or replicate violence? I think there's something there in terms of like the role of the family and community in responding to violence and harm in a creative way that takes us outside of that kind of criminal legal framework. I'm really interested in doing more of that now.
I'm not going to say what chapter I would do, because I've had plenty of chances to do chapters. But when I heard Beth's remarks, I was like, wait a second, she has another chapter, which was the remarks at the beginning just about the queer family. I was like, just like that whole thing is something that would be so valuable. And it would be so valuable because, then going to the big ideas is that it teaches everyone. It tells the story of queer people and their experience, but it tells the story of all of of straight people or quasi-straight people in all of their experiences in a way that I think is really powerful. So, okay, Vandana had a question, and we're going to make this one. Are there more? I think this will be the last question before we wrap up. So, Vandana, are you here?
Yep. Did you want me to say what my question is? It's in the chat, but
yeah, I can't quite see it all.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I was, well, firstly, thank you. I learned so much, as I always do. What a brilliant panel. So my question is basically this, that I'm curious as to whether understanding families as they really are can shed light on what seems to me to be a crisis. And this is not just anecdotal. I've read a little about it, but I'm not a social scientist. Basically, a crisis of loneliness and social isolation, including among young people. And I'm just wondering, what does, so, you know, on the one hand, we're talking about families, kinship groups, and different kinds of families and what we mean by families. And on the other hand, you have this crisis of social isolation. So what does that say about families, assuming that that, you know, this is not just anecdotal. So
It's not just anecdotal, Vandana. I mean, you are naming something that I think has to be in the next edition, but it has to be out sooner than that. The crisis of loneliness is something that really challenges that kind of cliche thing of who we're connected to and how we feel kinship. And the crisis of loneliness comes in a lot of different spaces. It comes in the sort of notion of people isolated. It also comes in the shape of people who are in uncomfortable relation with each other. And what I'm thinking of is the uncomfortable relation of people in the workplace, in our fractured workplace, the uncomfortable relation of people I'm teaching childhood and adolescence, and my students are teaching me a lot about their concerns about the alienation in technology. And before I kind of slip into just, you know, sort of stereotyping their concerns or what those concerns are at all, I can say that I think that we don't have enough to say about it. And that's, you know, a very high quality question. So thank you. So.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I just stuck it in the chat as well. But I was excited by your question because in doing this research around queer family and queer family networks, I found all this research that showed the strength of those bonds and the transformative power of those bonds and those kinship networks. And something that what that means, and this also actually relates to Lisa, a little bit of your question, is that there's such an important power in families of support, right? Which is like the ways that this could be a really unique transformative support. And sometimes our parents can't react the way to a disclosure of sexual assault that we would need, but kinship, our family, in terms of friends, can, because they have, you know, for lots of reasons, to do with socialization and expectations, and that's a whole other story or book. And so that's an exciting part of these kinship families to think about. That's what your question brought up for me. And transformative justice also acknowledges what you mentioned, which is that people are lonely, increasingly lonely, that a lot of kids these days say that there's no one they can trust. Some of my students in here are probably familiar when we do pod mapping at the end of my classes, which is where they come up with who would you call if you hurt somebody and who would you call if you were hurt by somebody. And often what students realize is that there's not a lot of people on that list. So how do we build those connections? How do we build up those bonds so that there are places that we could turn to?
Thank you, Beth and Vandana. Thank you for your great question. So we're just going to wrap up. We're going to run around to each of the speakers to see, it's going to be unsatisfying. We can't say enough of what we want to talk about, but give us what you got to round us out.
We're being shy, I guess. Give you what I've got. Thank you for being here. Please pick up a copy of the book. Make sure that the library has it. And also, if you can, please follow our Instagram account for the Border Awareness Program, which I just put in the chat. I also shared with you the link so that you could donate for our students. All the money that's donated will go directly to our students so that they can help to pay for the trip, and more than just hearing about immigrant families, let's make sure that, you know, we also do stuff about it, right? So $5, $10, we'll take any.
Beth or X?
I was
Yeah.
pulling up.
Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead, X.
Wait, dude. I would just echo again, thanks for everyone for being here. And if there's another just takeaway nugget is this is a big political year for us in the US. And pay attention to politics targeted at the least powerful, least smallest groups, their intentions, why, their motivations. I think that threads through a lot of our contributions. And yeah, stay aware. Thank you.
And I will say now there's a lot of pressure. Now I'm last. That's why I was trying to go second to last. I'm going to send a link in the chat. If you want more information about transformative justice and family sexual violence, that's to the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And then I would wrap up by saying, make sure that your solutions to problems don't recreate those problems, even if they feel good, or if they feel satisfying emotionally. That doesn't mean that it's the move. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, my last comments are make sure that you have fantastic colleagues. And then my other last comment is to say that we need to keep staying aware, keep staying active, keep staying good at listening to each other. And these are lessons that you could imagine they feel like earnest lessons of goodness. But what I mean to say is that these are the lessons when we dig in and study topics related to families as they really are. What we come to are these truths that are about how to be good scholars and be good people in our world. I mean, I really think that that's true when we're doing it right, and we did it right today. So I'm just going to finish up and say thank you to everyone for coming to this event to launch the Families as They Really Are and to celebrate the Framingham State University contingent to the book. So thanks, y'all. And May, do you have any?
I could not have said it better. Thanks to everyone for attending. These are wonderful events. I learned so much, and I feel really lucky to be colleagues with the folks on this panel and the other people in this room and to be part of this community. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists, and a special thank you to Virginia for facilitating so skillfully and graciously.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.